Hey everyone, thanks for joining. This is David Cervantes from Pine Brick Cap. I'm hosting Guy Berger, labor market superstar. We all know him from Twitter. He's graciously taking some time to chat with us about what's going on in the labor market. Time is short. We'll keep this one short. We have lots to unpack, so I'm just going to go straight at it. Guy, what is your view of the labor market right now, other than what we all know? We all know it's slowing, but what does it mean? What's the context here?
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say that the biggest surprise to me over the last few months is I was pretty sure things would be slowing down around this time. And by slowing down, I don't just mean lower payrolls. I think that's sort of that is par for the course, but also rising unemployment rate, falling share of prime working age Americans with a job. And a lot of that latter stuff hasn't happened. Um, and there are a bunch of theories out there. Some of them is that the stuff that is going to cause that stuff to take a turn for the worse just hasn't kicked in. I mean, there's still been so much flip-flopping on the tariffs, early stages of the tariffs being implemented. The other theory, and I think one that you and I have talked about a lot, is the degree to which we're also having, and Fed Chair Powell's talked about it, is the degree that the squeeze on labor supply growth through immigration is just offsetting that. So you have some forces that are obviously causing the labor market to loosen, but other ones are causing it to tighten. And these have sort of so far mostly offset each other. And so we're just in a, I mean, I guess it's a particularly optimistic world to have one with very low payroll growth and stable slack, but maybe that's the world we're finding ourselves in. And it's a surprise, but it's not like totally, let me say it this way. It's definitely one of those theories that you could have, like things you could have predicted this year. And I guess I haven't seen any strong evidence to convince me that is not the case. I'm open to it not being the case, but so far it seems like it's an okay description of where we are.
Now, what does this mean for Fed policy? Because, right now, odds for a Fed cut in September right now, I think 92.6, something like that, right? They're high. It's pretty much a lock at this point. Um, but the labor market is not showing, at least on the face of it, any signs of deterioration. But yet today's CPI report, had some inflationary impulses under the hood there. So how do we justify a cut with increasing inflation and a headline employment figures that suggest things are fine for the most part?
Yeah, I mean, let's say it this way. I always joke that I'm a labor market expert, but I'm a Fed dilettante in the sense that I like to think about the Fed. And obviously, you have to think about the Fed if you're a labor market person because what the Fed does affects it. Let's say it this way. I think that the reason for the Fed to cut would be, things have been stable so far, but are they, is there pressure building under the hood that's going to cause numbers to really take a turn for the worse? And I do think it's really important to emphasize. We heard it from Chair Powell. I think that thinking about the monthly payroll numbers is leading some people astray because a lot of the weakening in payroll growth is coming from the supply side. There's just fewer people being added to the workforce. You're going to add fewer jobs in a steady unemployment environment. The way I sort of described to you is once is we have a slack neutral slowing in employment growth. Now, it does not mean, by the way, that we can just slow employment growth infinitely without having an impact. Maybe at 30,000 jobs a month, we really are going to start seeing the unemployment rate go up. So, like, I don't, this is not intended as a categorical comment, but just that I think slowing payroll growth alone is not a sign of labor market weakening, which is why Powell emphasized look at the unemployment rate, look at some other things in ratios in the household survey. On the inflation side, the defense of the Fed easing is these are temporary tariff effects. And we'll see a boost in inflation for sure, but once prices pass through, inflation is going to go back down to where it was before. It may even go lower to the degree that you think this is a tax hike that squeezes consumers and businesses on the demand side. So it's not a crazy argument to think that it's that this is that a cut is worth it. But it's also not a foregone conclusion that the U.S. economy needs it. And I think that conversation is, let me say it this way. I think it's with a lot spoken with a lot of conviction by people that the U.S. economy obviously needs a cut given the dual mandate, and I don't share that view. I mean, I think there's a case for it. It's based on certain things, but I think it's also possible that we're, in an era of inflation still being high, even excluding the tariffs, and the labor market slack, which is what the Fed's responsible for in its other mandate, is maybe stable.
So what do you think is the break even rate for NFP to keep U3, the unemployment rate, stable. I mean, I had it penciled prior to this year in the low, 125, 130,000, somewhere there. Now I'm looking at 75, 80,000, but you're suggesting that, I heard you mention 30,000 a month. Would a 30,000 a month NFP print, have a meaningful impact on U3? Or where do you think, I know it's, touchy feely, kind of fuzzy, but what's your ballpark on that?
Look, I think that a few things. The first is I think it's hard to measure, particularly because I think there's a good chance that the payroll numbers we see right now are going to be revised and probably revised down. I don't have I think I have a fair amount of conviction on the numbers through March 2025, and I think there's a decent chance that the overcount has continued since then. So in some sense, when we say the numbers that you just say you give a number of 75K, or 90K or whatever, some other numbers, like what is that number going to look like after future revisions? Is the first sort of aspect I think I kind of want to get people's minds into is that, by the way, that doesn't really change my view on what the break even is, but just throwing people's minds at like the number that keeps labor market sort of holding steady could be really low. That aside, I mean, 35K seems on the low side. I mean, a lot of the estimates I've seen are some of them are even higher than yours at like 90K. But the other aspect is I would expect that number to keep drifting down because I think there's still, to some extent, the way I would think about it is to the degree that unemployment, create this big backlog of people that are trying to make their way and settle into the workforce. I would think that like we are still making our way through that backlog right now, even as the tap of people coming into the country has been reduced very, very sharply. And so it is I would expect to keep slowing. I mean, I've seen some estimates by the end of the year it could be as low as 10K a month.
Well,
The other aspect of it is that I do think about a lot is just, we have this aging population that's still ongoing, right? You don't bring people
right.
in that is going to keep turning this down. Like, would it be outlandish in the next few years if the immigration taps don't reopen, that we have negative payroll growth consistent with a steady unemployment rate? I mean, look at what I
They
mean.
were
I
they were
sort of think about
Japan.
Japan or Southern
Yeah,
Europe, right? These are places, and it creates some weird things. I mean, Jed Kolko had this amazing, who's an incredible economist. We don't you follow Dave, but you don't follow
yeah, yeah.
Jed. You should take
No,
out. And he
I
had this
follow
great
him.
thing about how the data is going to look like in a world where we have very low, and it's low payroll growth, low GDP growth, which by the way probably matters a lot if you're investing in equities and things like that, and also probably means a neutral rate of interest should go down over time. Maybe AI offsets that. But it's just it's a world we're not used to. We're just used to like strong payroll numbers, strong labor
Right,
market, weak payroll numbers, weak labor market. And I think right now we're seeing those things become detached a little bit.
right. That's what's happening in Italy for sure. I think they're just the rate of aging and the labor force shrinking. They've got negative labor growth, but they still have falling employment or something like that. I mean, it's something crazy that I can't wrap my head around.
Germany
But
too is like, again, there's immigration stuff that's offset that, but it's a long running trend and it's really
yeah,
kicking in now.
going back to the Fed, I was, formulating my labor market views. I had a look at the SOM rule, and I know the Fed doesn't is not a slave to any one rule in particular, whether it's Taylor or SOM. But they obviously look at these things.
Yeah.
And right now, SOM is, I believe, at 0.10. It's actually been falling. So despite what's the low NFP, the NFP revisions, SOM is telling us, we are pretty far from at least a labor market induced recession that we've been in a while. And I just find that hard to reconcile with this itch to start cutting for the sake of the labor market. I mean, if the inflation is falling, then sure, let's cut all the way. But with it's just I think it becomes optically hard to justify cuts when these kinds of indicators are flashing. Anyway, that's my
And
personal.
harder to, I mean, I guess what I'll say is one of the numbers, I won't say who said it, but I think we can all guess, that said we should cut rates to 1%. Like, fair enough, 25 basis points. Maybe, Governor Bowman's right, and it's going to be 75 basis points for the rest of the, I mean, like, I said, I'm not a Fed guy, but I'm aware of these things. And it comes down to like, there's no way in these circumstances you're going to cut rates to 1%.
No.
Like, it just doesn't, and I think that's sort of it. There's this tension. I mean, yeah, I like your example of the summer without I'm a longtime fan of Claudia, and like it's a great. I think it's like one of the great rules of thumb that she created. But the other thing is like it highlights something, which is yes, this was by the way, like let's not sugarcoat this report too much. I think do people do play up the low payroll growth a little too much, given what we talked about. But like it was a bad report. The unemployment rate went up. The prime working age employment population ratio went down. And so there's no sugarcoating. If we keep getting reports like this, the labor market will clearly be loosening, and I'll be tossing the labor supply issue as an explanation very quickly. So there's that one path we could be finding ourselves in. But like, if you look back at the period from like the spring of 2023 to about the summer of 24, we had a lot of these with stronger payroll growth, but like
Right.
we had a lot of these reports where the unemployment rate went up. The unemployment rate went up by the reason why that summer got triggered sometime, and it caused the Fed to ease, and miraculously, as soon as they started easing, the labor market stabilized, is because we were getting bad jobs reports. And I think
Right.
like that's a key thing is the environment over the past year actually has been different. Now it could be turning again. Like to me, I know I talked to a lot of people that are pessimistic of the labor market. Maybe this is a turning point. This is the first in the string of job reports that put us north of 4.5% unemployment rate, maybe close to 5. Could happen. But like the trajectory, this is coming. You'd expect in a period where we're stable to periodic get jobs reports like this. And so I just wouldn't assume, unless you have a very strong conviction. I mean, if you have a very strong conviction, this is sort of the turning point has happened.
Right.
Yeah, but I like tend to be pretty careful about this stuff. I've been around like I've been caught offside so many times in the labor market the past few years, which should raise questions about my judgment. Certainly good at staring at it. I'm not necessarily as good at telling you where it's going to go, but it does make
Right.
me very careful about sort of making pronouncements about where we're headed.
Sure, sure. Try trading bonds, but
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly.
that brings me to another thing about the evolutions in the labor market. Typically, I'm of the old Ed Leamer school of thought, where the housing cycle is the business cycle, and that a lot of with 7 out of 11 post-war recessions originating in the housing market, that construction employment was the thing to watch, and construction employment it's still, I believe, it's still growing, but it's barely, breaking even. It's
Construction
really slowed
spending
down.
is nominal construction spending shrinking.
Yeah. To be clear, the focus is residential construction, not
Yeah,
just
yeah, fair, fair,
not.
fair.
Anyway, do you think it'll be different this time, where we could have, with mortgage rates, still high, and construction coming to a crawl, where it bucks the trend, where we manage to not have a recession that's triggered by the in softness in the construction industry, where we've seen that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, let's
And
even talk
AI, for
about this.
example,
Construction,
data centers.
construction. Listen, we're talking about residential construction. There's probably a pretty high correlation with that workforce and the labor supply issue we talked about. So first thing, like again, we're talking about construction. There's squeezes from the demand side via mortgages. The economy is slowing, which may slow it. And then on the flip side, you have the inputs being squeezed too. It is, we have tariffs that are
Right.
making construction materials much more expensive. We are um, getting that labor force
Immigration.
squeezed.
Yeah,
So
immigration.
I guess what I'm saying is like I never really thought again the reason why construction is a big part of the business cycle is because of that like demand side forces mostly, right? Like, people we just have too many houses. So I mean temporary like not the YIMBY NIMBY debate, but just literally like there's an
Right.
inventory of houses you need to build. It's harder to get financing, you reduce activity, and that's a big cyclical drag on the economy. What happens if housing, some aspect of that is a structural supply side drag, right? Like, yes, housing is slow. That's going to lead to GDP growth, but we're talking about it again. We're talking about slower GDP growth in the supply sense, and I don't know to what degree it makes sense to think of that. I mean, I know I'm being very nuanced and kind of
I mean,
three-handed
that's
economist
yeah.
here, but I guess I'm really interested in, is this story make sense in a world where like this isn't just a demand side housing slowdown that, is historically associated with downturns, but a supply side one where it's just hard, it's gotten much more expensive to build houses. And so as a result, activity just shuts down because of that.
Hmm.
I don't
And what
know.
about what about the I was actually talking to Mike Kluxell earlier. He told me to pester you about this. The AI factor in the labor market. I mean, obviously, no, I'm not saying AI employment, but is this AI spending capital X cycle how does that support the labor market, if at all? I mean, I think it does, but what's the channel by which this capex cycle supports the labor market?
It's funny. I was having an exchange about this with Connor Sen. I think he and I, despite I'm a huge fan of Connor, and,
Yeah, that's great.
wonderful
Yeah,
guy. But like, I think this is a place where he and I disagree. Probably is like I think Connor brought up an really interesting. So first, I think when people mostly talk about AI hurting the labor market, what they think about is like an automation type story.
right. And mass
Companies are
layoffs.
planning to replace labor, and that's been one of the things that's thrown out. I think. And I'm not super convinced by it as an entire explanation, though there might be a little bit of it. The argument that, like, for example, the unemployment rate for young college grads has gone up as a result. Could be playing a role. I don't think it's a primary one, but like possible. But I think Connor made an interesting other argument, which is, you know what, this is actually much more of a, a crowding out type situation where, with rates where they are, capital scarce and it's being sucked up by AI, building data centers and investing in models and not in building houses. And I think that like, let me say this way, and then the second part of his argument, which I think is an interesting one, and by the way, the first part I actually find is somewhat plausible. Like this is sort of the story economists always told when interests are high, capital is scarce. Like one of the things, the cost of a big deficit is a reduced amount of capital available to the private sector. And now that there's a big booming capital investment sector that's squeezing out the private, plausible to me. I'll let the experts in that area tell me whether I'm right. But there's a second part of that concept that I'm less convinced by, which is but though it could be true, I'm willing to be persuaded because I want if I see data is the argument that residential construction is very labor intensive, data center construction is less labor intensive. Maybe is that true? I don't know, but it's plausible, and some of the stuff in there is like very capital heavy,
Right.
and that is essentially your the capex that's being done is less capital intensive, and that's hurting the labor market.
Got
Possible.
it.
I mean, I guess
Yeah.
like it's possible, but like I don't, and it's an unusual and interesting argument. So I actually like it from an intellectual perspective, but I think I'd want to see some, and again, not to pot shot because Connor may turn out to be right, but like I would want to see evidence this is true because the second part of that to me seems dicier than the first. The crowding out thing, sure, I buy that as plausible. I actually agree. I've agreed with that. Connor made that point a few years ago, and I've kind of agreed with him since then.
The crowding out thesis kind of contradicts my view that public sector deficits are private sector surpluses. So with the government running these huge deficits, shouldn't that kind of you know that fuel does that help propel the economy forward and increase production, GDP, blah 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 blah? I mean, is that an offset there? These deficits?
I guess what I say is like the deficit thing, just like the I don't want to let me back up. Like the reason I think of crowding out, interest rates are high, and I think there's some people here that say it's literally the Fed doing everything, like doing it all. But my guess, particularly is that we have elevated long-term rates, is it's not just that. Essentially businesses and households, their demand for investment or for resources is higher than it was during the period of low interest rates, low long-term interest rates. And so coming to it, like to me, the federal government deficit is an example, like is sort of a possible cause of this. I mean, it's and the question is, would interest rates go down if the federal government actually cut back its deficit? I'm inclined to think so, but I guess that's
Yeah.
sort of like what my view on that on crowding out mostly comes from is long term and I mean short term interest rates because the Fed, but also long term interest rates are high. There's clearly like this is not you could make a case in the 20 teen for a large chunk of the 20 teens and right after the pandemic that we were in a savings glut where there was too much saving and it outpaced the amount of investment that people want to do. That is no longer the case. And I think that's sort of the core crowding out thesis. Right now, there's actually a scarcity of savings. People in the private sector and the government are competing for that savings. And as a result, interests are higher. Some forms of investment and spending are not happening. Right? Which is, I mean, to me, like, again, I buy that because I take the existence of high interest rates seriously.
So let me ask you this. Just going back to
By the way, I'm a
we
labor
were.
guy, so some public finance person or an MT person
Yeah,
commonly
yeah,
say
yeah,
guy is
yeah,
full of it. But
yeah.
that's my basic economist explanation.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Going back to where we started, and I mentioned Italy as an example, where the labor force is shrinking, whether it's due to demographics, immigration, or the combo. With what do you think is the GDP hit from the current administration's immigration policies? Like, is this something that we can just kind of hand wave off? as AI productivity will fix it all, or the shrinking of the labor force really means shrinking GDP.
Let's say this way. Like, I guess my rough estimate, just based on like census population estimates, it was a very rough estimate. There are people that have modeled this, and I would expect it was something like a percentage point in growth. So it's
Wow.
not, it's like pretty, I mean, again,
Yeah, that's a
is that
lot.
huge? Is that something that on its own would tip us into like permanent contraction? No, but it means like substantially lower GDP growth. Like if we thought 2.5, 3% is what we're having, maybe you shave a percentage point off. Now, the second part is AI. Like, it's funny. I was reading that The Economist recently had a report about what would happen if people that are saying 20, 30% GDP. Like, I mean, let me say it this way. If you think that AI is like a high value, non-dud technology like the internet, then that probably boosts productivity growth from where it's recently been by like a percentage point and a half. Like, the normal thing is like 2.5 percentage point
Right.
productivity growth is high productivity growth by the standards of like, the second half of the 20th century. Um, and like that's a pretty substantial offset. Like, I mean, then you could start talking about we could get like 3% GDP growth again on a pretty regular basis. But like again, and that by the way seems to be like an okay prediction. Like again, I'm somebody I always describe as like either a mild pessimist or a mild optimist on AI in the sense that like I think this will have big transformational impacts on the economy. I just don't think this is like, bigger than fire was, or electricity.
And,
I mean,
and the
but
and the
if
question,
AI turns out to be
go
a
ahead.
dud, or if it
Yeah.
takes a lot longer than people think. And again, I think that I've been going back and forth with Bob Elliott about this, like, and I think he and I are on the same page, like, it's just going to take longer. But like, if you're expecting it to happen right away, we could go through a period of low growth, waiting for this technology to start really shaking things up. It could last a while.
Yeah, no, I was saying, discovery or engineering versus mass implementation, adoption, those timescales could vary drastically, and it also depends on other policies and other things going on in the economy and what drives them. So, whether it's robotics, AI with robotics, or all these technological marvels that are coming about, we just don't know. And that's a good point you make that even though we may get to the promised land of high productivity, it could be a while where we just kind of go through the valley of low growth, shrinking labor force, and then, but that's a longer kind of more glacial discussion. Going back to things that matter for a lot of our friends on X or on Substack. So given the what could happen with the labor market in terms of lower break even, lower NFP break evens for U3, given that the labor market is not super duper great, but it's not totally going off the rails and falling apart. Where would you put U3 say a year from now? What's your
I
thought
mean,
there?
my best guess is like 4.5. Like, I
Okay.
mean, if I were to lean on this, I'm still on the camp of like things are probably going to be cooler. Like the cooling is going to resume at a slow pace going
Hmm.
forward because of modest drag on the economy. But I'm pretty uncertain, man. I mean, like the way I sort of think about it is we're sort of in this world of, and you and I've talked about this, like we have these big, powerful forces squeezing the labor market from different directions and pushing in different directions, and they've sort of netted out. But it's
Right.
different than normal in the sense that normally when things are steady, we're just like, there's not things nudging it too much in every direction. And I feel like that I'm more inclined to think that I'll be surprised in a year than I normally would be by that. By
Hmm.
it being either higher than 4.5 or lower, or even lower than, I mean, like, would I be shocked? I might be surprised, but would I be shocked that it's lower a year from now than it is today? No. I would say that I'd put like a 25, 30% chance on that
So,
happening.
so one last, I know you got to go. One last question. So, given all these dynamics that we're talking about, shrinking labor force, cooling labor market, is that going to dampen any tariff-related inflationary impulse? In other words, people just have, with the lower growth environment, you're going to have less nominal spending growth. How do you see that? Do you think it's realistic that whatever tariff related inflationary impulse is dampened or offset by, the labor market dynamics? Is that kind of a realistic way to look at things?
I mean, it just depends. I mean, let's say this way. I gave you like my what I told you is in all likelihood I expect the labor market to be a little slacker a year from now. But I also
Mhm.
told you there's a decent chance that it's not that like the possibility that it's not is hot, like you should be on your radar. And the same thing with all these policies. Like I just would not. In all likelihood, is policy like going to essentially be disinflationary over the next year? Leave aside what'll happen to the Fed, like, yes, I think that's probably the case, but like, I just wouldn't assume that's a certainty. Like, it could, the opposite could happen, which is that in fact, all these policies are squeezing the supply side more than demand side. And so, even though you have things like the tariffs are dragging down demand, like the capacity of the economy shrinks by more, and suddenly we're in an overheating economy again. That cannot be ruled. I mean, setting aside what happened, like the temporary tariff effect we could be there. Like,
Hmm.
I would, I'm a little worried about that. Like, I think even with the tariffs, people are like, I mean, I know the Treasury Secretary said, well, tariffs are a tax, so they're contractionary. I expect them to be disinflationary. On the face of it, setting aside short-term effects, I would, I'm willing to grant that some credence. I've even said that, like, I actually would, that would be my naive thing, is that tariffs are disinflationary. But, like, what if we're putting tariffs on raw inputs, on capital goods that are shrinking the productive side of the economy? How can we be so sure that like we're not having a big impact on that side? We know from immigration side we are.
Right.
Um, I'm worried about that. Like we're shrinking, we're sort of tying, we're not, setting aside whatever merits tariff have, we're tying our hands behind our backs with some of these policies.
Hmm.
We're if the U.S. economy is Samson, we're cutting off its hair.
Guy
Well, I
Berger,
never used that metaphor before, but I like it.
thanks a lot for your time, man. I know you got to
Sure,
go.
this is
Appreciate you.
awesome.
We'll get this up and let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely, dude. Thank you.
All right, take care, man. Bye.